1 Corinthians in chapter 10. We're going to be there, but I want us to look at one verse in chapter 11. In verse 1 in chapter 11, and then we'll go back in 1 Corinthians in chapter 10. Be ye followers of me, and that is to follow the example, to imitate, another word to imitate, even as I also am of Christ. Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. And that verse there, now you should understand that the Bible was not written with chapter and verses from the beginning. Okay, there were letters that were given, but that's, again, this came much later. I believe 12th century, around that time. And so this verse here, where he says, be ye followers of me in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, really, I believe, is tied into the previous chapter. Now, you'll realize that when we go through 1 Corinthians 10. So again, we can't mistake that. You have to be careful sometimes reading the chapter and verse and thinking that, well, now it's split up and it doesn't mean that. No, when you're reading the scriptures, you need to understand it was all one book, one letter. Sometimes there were sections, but other times, again, these chapter and verses, it helps to kind of know where you're going, but that's about it, okay? So we understand that this actually goes prior into chapter 10. Well, I think that is a wonderful thing, that we should also strive in our lives. Just like Paul said, be followers. I mean, everybody wants to be, it seems like, leaders. And yet, the sad reality is that they want to be leaders, but they don't have the right focus, and there's some that say, well, follow me. I know what I'm doing. Follow me. I've had more experience. Paul doesn't just say that. He says, follow me. Why? Because I am a follower of who? Christ. Now, you have to understand that we're all going to follow something in our lives. There are some that will stand there and say, well, no, I live my life for myself. I do what I want. But no, when you really get into their understanding and ideology and beliefs and everything else, they themselves are following something. And so again, we look here in that passage, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Let's look as we go back and we'll see what Paul was meaning fully. In chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians in verse 1, he says, moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant. Now, that was the thing about with the church of Corinth. I think most churches in America could relate with the church of Corinth. There were a lot of problems in Corinth. They allowed the world to get into the church, and they began to be very corrupted. And again, there were a lot of things that they were ignorant of, and a lot of things they just didn't even want to know. And so Paul would write to them, and he would tell them and encourage them to live a holy life, to encourage them to follow the Lord. And there's a lot of things he writes to them about. Paul doesn't write to them because he's angry and hates them. He writes to them because he wants them to live the life that God has for them. Of course, he tells them, I would not have you to be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Now he's talking about that cloud of God's protection that was with the children of Israel when they went and they were delivered from Egypt. He's talking about them going through the Red Sea. They were all baptized under Moses in the cloud and in the sea. There's this representation, this symbology here of them going through that Red Sea and they're coming out the other side. And it's almost, there was rejoicing, there was praise for the children of Israel. And it's almost in the sense of this deliverance from sin, a sinful life, coming through the waters and coming out from the other side. And now you've been delivered from that. And there's praise and rejoicing. But sadly, what happened? Well, they ended up turning away from the Lord. It says in verse 3, they did all eat the same spiritual meat. What was that there? That was the supernatural food that was given, the manna from heaven, even the quail that was sent to them. And so they took part of that meat and they did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. That living water that Jesus said, that will flow forth, an unending, this living water, they partook. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. For these things were our examples. There are admonitions, there are warnings, there are examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So we understand the reality is that in our lives, we're either examples for good or for bad. When we look and we see Paul said, follow me because I'm a follower of Christ. But then we see the example of the Israelites and how their examples that were set were horrible. Many of them, because again, what did they do? Instead of thanking God, praising God, believing in God, they began to say, well, God just brought us out here to kill us. God doesn't care about us. We want to go back to Egypt. There were so many things, sadly, that took place and so many temptations and struggles in their lives. And so they were set forth as an example. And the example there was that we should not lust after carnal things, evil things in our lives. And he goes on to say in verse 7, there's a warning that he gives here. There's a warning against idolatry. He says, neither be ye idolaters. Don't worship false gods as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Well, this was that time when Moses was on the mount, received the commandments, and of course the children of Israel said, we don't know what happened to Moses. We don't even care anymore. Let's make our own, let's make a graven image. Aaron, you should make us an idol that we can worship. We want to be like other nations. And so that is sad reality what had taken place. And not only that, but then also they began to commit lewd and wicked, perverse acts with one another. So he says here, you to the intent, don't be idolaters. He says, what did they do? They sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. There's that warning against idolatry. Some people would say, well, we don't have that type of idolatry today. We really don't have that. Well, you may not have the images. By the way, we do have images. You ought to go and you research some things that they put up not long ago in New York City. Of course, you can go here in Tuscaloosa. We've got a goddess Minerva standing right there with a crescent moon and an owl right there here in across the river. You look at that river. We've already got those things. So people say, well, we don't have any idols. Yeah, we do. But I mean, an idol doesn't have to be the image. You can have an idol placed within your heart. Nobody sees, but you know, it's in the throne of your heart. You have, you don't have that worship unto Christ as you should, and you place something else before God. And of course, I would say that we do have rampant idolatry in this country. Ishtar was the goddess Ishtar, of course, also known as Inanna. And that she was the goddess in Mesopotamia at that time. And of course, she embodied sexuality. And she was known as the goddess of sexual love and war. And she was known as eroticism. She wasn't the goddess of marriage. She was the goddess of really perversion. One of the things about her was that she was androgynous. In fact, there was a writing about her that was a hymn. That in the text, she said, I am a woman, I am a man. I am a woman, I am a man. That's thousands of years ago. But somehow they worshiped that. And there were those who worshiped and followed Ishtar. And they actually would end up trying to change their genders. That's what they did. This isn't anything new. That had been going on thousands of years. But it's happening again, isn't it? So we do have idolatry in this country. The sad thing, there were festivals there. And some of the festivals to the goddess involved reversals of age. Now that's going on, by the way, too. They're talking about trying to change with age of consent, lowering all that. And they're talking about, well, I saw just the other day a man claim to be, really, he's a baby. He's a baby. He was 45 years old, somewhere around there, but he's a 6-year-old child. And these people adopted him. I look at it, I think he's not just insane. The ones adopted him are insane. But they do. They coddle him and they pat him on the head and they tell him, and boy, he's got his little crib and he's got all these things. And he just says, sometimes I feel like a little 6-year-old girl. This is where we are. But this isn't anything new. This had been going on then. We have idolatry in this country. We have this type of sinful wickedness. Because again, Paul will talk about not just the idolatry would take place. He says, let us not commit fornication. The warning against that. This type of perverseness that goes on, the immorality that takes place, it is going on now. It wasn't just back then. I hear so many times people talk about, with technology, mankind will get better. That was the belief in the 30s and 40s, especially when the Industrial Revolution hit. Things began to spread out. Life began to get a little better, and boy, with the invention there, with canned goods and everything else, and people were able to live a little longer. And you had clean drinking water and things. Boy, people said, mankind is just going to get better and better and better. We don't need God. Well, I don't care how good technology gets. Mankind's heart is always corrupt. Amen. Well, then it's sad because that is what took place. See, the festivals that took place was not just the reversals of age and not just status, but gender. In fact, at the festivals, what they would do was they would run around and the men would dress as women and the women would dress as men. And they would get the children to act like adults, and the adults would act like children. So again, is that going on here in America? It is, and we don't weep over it enough. We really don't. We don't really care too much. And it really it bothers me to see how little people really care. They want to hide away, and we can't. This is something we need to pray about, and we need to ask God to give us a brokenness over this, because it is sad to see what has taken place. Many Satanists, they'll claim they don't worship Baphomet, but the statue that they have, that they will place in many of their temples, that's the statue of Baphomet, and the statue has male parts and it has female parts. The idea of androgyny. So again, that is taking place. The idea is that, really the Baphomet is non-binary is what they state. There's another idol that was worshipped even at that time, the Israelites. His name was Moloch. Moloch. Do you know what that idol was known for? It was a calf's head, and it had extended its arms out, or ox's head, and it extended its brass arms out. And under Moloch, there was a furnace that would take place. And of course, they would actually put their children in those arms of the idol and burn their children, sacrifice their children. They did that because they believed that they would obtain favor from Moloch, financial favor. Is that going on today? You may not have the image of Moloch, you may not have the statue, but you better believe Planned Parenthood is Moloch. It's there. We sacrifice the children, millions of them dying, being aborted. And I saw not long ago where some women, about 20 years old, they were being confronted about their beliefs on abortion. And the man said, I can't believe you believe these things about the baby. She said, don't call it a baby. Don't. He said, well, what is it then? She said, it's a fetus. He said, do you know what fetus even means? He said, in Latin, it means offspring. It really just means baby. But the thing in this country, and it's all over the place, if you can change it and make it sound better, it's then you just don't think much about it. It's the same when World War II, when ones came back from the war, they experienced great trauma, they said they were shell-shocked. You ever use that word, shell-shocked? Well, that was just too hard for many people. And years went by and they changed that to different things. And finally they came out with PTSD. It just sounds a little better than shell-shocked. Well, in the same way, it's sad because what has taken place in this country as well, there is great idolatry that is happening. And Paul tells them not to. He warns them against idolatry, what was taking place at that time. And he tells them, let us not commit fornication. Indulge in that sensual immorality. He says what took place is that many fell in one day. 23,000 died because they had went against God. He warns not only against fornication and against idolatry, but he warns against a rebellious spirit. He says, don't let us tempt Christ. The wording there means trying his patience. Really, he's talking about that many of them rebelled against God and said, can God really take care of us? Can God really bless us? Is he really for us? And he warns them, he says, don't do this, because many of them were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Don't complain. Don't have discontentment in your heart. Don't have doubts and disbelief and anger against God and a rebellious spirit. Now again, notice verse 11. Now all these things happen unto them for examples, in samples, that they are written for our admonition. Paul makes it a point. We don't do away with the Old Testament. We go, we read, we learn, and we understand what not to do in our lives. They are left as examples. The sad thing is that wouldn't it be great if there were examples of, we do see examples of faithfulness, but if they all were faithful to the Lord and they said we're going to go and conquer Canaan, I don't think they would have wandered there that long in the wilderness. We don't know. But they wandered so long because they continued to rebel against God. We leave examples in our lives, whether it be good or bad. And that is what happened with the children of Israel. He says they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Now that's an interesting statement as well. When he says this here, he believes that the climax of the end of time is upon them. And the moment that Jesus ascended to heaven, do you realize that we're living in the last days? The moment he ascended into heaven, he said, I'm coming back. We don't know when, but the moment we're living in the last days. Paul believed it. And notice he says, he warns not just against spiritual rebellion, but against spiritual pride. He says, wherefore, let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Take heed lest he fall. You may think that you're on top. You may think that you can overcome. You may think you're doing well. He said, but you better be careful. Take heed. Because you can fall. You can mess up. And then we notice as we go on, look in verse 13, and I think this is a wonderful, wonderful promise that's given. Because in all of this, he reminds them something is so important. We ought to understand this in our own hearts and lives. He says, there has no temptation taken you. There has no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. He said, you have not faced enticement of sin that nobody else is. Listen, everybody has faced some kind of temptations in life, the struggles in life, all of this. We may sit there and say, well, you just don't understand what I'm going through. All of us face different temptations, different struggles in life. He says, there's no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful. Do you believe that? God is faithful. That's the wonderful promise here. He reminds them, don't do these things. Here are examples to let us know not to follow after these things. He said, and the reality is this, know that if you struggle with temptation, everybody struggles. That is, sadly, the burden. And yet, God is faithful. He said he will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able. Now, again, I've heard this at times people talk about and say, well, God will not give you more than you can handle. And what they're saying is they're talking about some of the trials in life. This is specifically dealing with temptation. This is dealing with sinful enticement and temptations. No one can say, no Christian can stand there and say, the devil made me do it. The devil made me do it. I couldn't help it. I think about it when I sometimes have to break up fights between the children and then find out. Isn't it really difficult to find out who started it first? Well, they made me angry. That's why. It's his fault. No, it's his fault. He started that. He said something about, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You see, we all want to be at a place where we couldn't help it. We can't help it. We just had to do those things. And what Paul says, notice he says, God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. He says that you may bear it patiently and escape from that temptation. You do not have to fall into that sinfulness in life. So there's a promise here of preservation. God will make a way of escape. There's some that say, I can't help it. I was born this way. You ever heard that? Of course, it's shocking to me where ones will say, well, I can't help it. I'm born this way. And then later on they say, well, it's just all in my mind. And, it's one or the other. If you're born that way, then you can't have transgenderism. But that's what they want. Well, I'm born this way to love the other. I can't help it. But then, well, I can choose what I want to be, and I'm just fluid. And it blows my mind, but that's the thinking oftentimes. Some say I can't help it. I was born this way. Some say I can't help it. I have to express myself. Others say I can't help it. I was raised this way. I was raised this way. I don't care what excuse you make. You don't have to do it. You don't have to. There has no temptation taken you, such as is common to man. God will make a way. He is faithful. And the question is, again, whether he is faithful. There's no question about that. The question is whether we're going to be faithful. Well, I can't help it. This is just who I am. Paul reminds them that there is deliverance and they can overcome. And then we notice as we go on, he says in verse 14, wherefore, my beloved brethren, dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. Again, he gives that warning. Why? Because idolatry was rampant then and it is rampant now. I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. The cup of blessing we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, being many, are one bread and one body. We are all partakers of that one bread. He's making a point in this, ultimately in these passages. He is making the point that he states here, communion with Christ will cause separation from sin. If you are going to claim to be a partaker of the gospel, a partaker of his righteousness, if you're going to claim to be part of the body of Christ, should you not live a life of holiness? He says we should not be living lives of corruption. And he speaks about the communion, the blood of Christ, the bread. The idea here of purity and holiness, sacredness. He says in verse 19, what say I then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything. But I say that the things which Gentiles sacrifice is sacrificed to devils, not to God, and I would not that you should fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the tables of devils. Now, the point he's making in this, what took place then, there were a lot of things we've talked about before, where they would sell certain meats in the marketplace. Those meats, they were offered up unto idols. Some of them, they'd sell them cheaper. And of course, sadly, in this day and time, the same with inflation and everything else, there people were concerned they needed to get cheap meat. And so for a Christian, they knew that meat meant nothing, it being sacrificed to idols. But what was also taking place is that there were festivals that would go on that some believers still began to think, well, maybe it'll be okay to be part of these festivals. I know that they're worshiping these idols here, but maybe I can just join in a little bit and in my heart worship God. And what he was saying was, because what would take place as well as they would be in those festivals, what people would raise a glass. By the way, the toast is paganistic. I don't know if you know that, but it's paganistic. Raising a glass and saying, I'm giving a speech, here's a toast. That's what they would do at that time. But they'd raise a glass, they'd give a speech, and they would give a prayer to the idol. And this is Paul is making a point. He's saying that what communion do you have where you go and you enjoy yourself in the festival? And yes, you know that there's no such thing as real, true other gods. There's only one God. But everybody sees you there. They see you raising the glass. They see you enjoying yourself. And they're saying to themselves, I guess they believe what I believe. Yesterday, we were at an event, Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Alabama. And I did what I normally do. I make balloon animals. And we had a lot of ones come and get the balloons and everything else. But there they had music blaring, blasting out our ears. I didn't like the music. My children didn't like the music. They sat there with, thankfully, they're holding their ears. And a lot of it really bad music playing. And I tell the kids, I said, look, it's not good music. It's not uplifting the Lord. I said, the reality though, we're here to invite. We had bags that we gave out we had VBS flyers. We had different things like that. And we were there to be part of the community and to try to get the word out. There was something that they were going to do afterwards. They were going to have food, free food, fried chicken. You better believe that this was hard not to do, but it was going to be served in a bar. We didn't go. We didn't go. I love free food, and I love fried chicken, but we didn't participate. You see, Jesus said, his prayer for the disciples, he said, I don't pray that you take them out of the world. That's not the answer. The answer is not to hide away, run away scared, and just say, well, I'm never going to come out. And I hope the world gets better. It won't if you don't do anything about it. If you don't actually go and witness, it won't. And Paul knows that, because later on, what does he say? Notice as he goes on. He says, look in verse 23. All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. He says, I want you to understand, yes, there are things that are permissible. Eating the meat, God's not going to strike you dead just because you eat meat that's offered to idols. He said, some things are not the best for me. And he goes on to say, he says, all things are lawful, but all things do not edify. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. So there's three principles, and I know this is we've gone a long introduction to get to this point, but I want to give you just simply three things to realize in your life. If you want to really look back in your life at the end of it all and say, I rejoice, because I can truly say to those who were following me that I was following Christ. So one, we need to live our lives, as Paul is showing here, a life that is serving others, not our flesh. That this should be our way of life. I was not there. See, now again, yesterday what we did, it was all simply to try to serve others. It wasn't much, but people would come up, they say, boy, those balloons, how much are they? Those are nice. And I'd say, they're free. No, yes. We're just giving them out. We're just trying to, give away and get the word out and let them know about VBS and different things going on. But again, if I would have been there and if I would have heard the music, I don't think it was bad for us to be a part of that event. But if I would have been up on stage dancing around, you think that would have been bad? There have been a lot of people that probably would have got a kick out of it. But yeah, I think that would have been bad. And I could have completely said, oh, but I'm just doing what other people are doing. They're enjoying the music. And I want people to see that I'm not a fuddy-duddy. Whatever that means. I know some of you know what that means. But we have to use discernment and discretion. And there are things, again, we do to understand that we serve others. But we also realize that some things we may want to do, some things we may think, and it's for ourselves. This is what would happen at that time, is that some of the believers at Corinth, they would say, well, I don't care about what everybody else thinks. I just want to enjoy the festivities. I just want to eat the meat and just have a good time. What's so wrong about that, Paul? And Paul's making a point. He says, listen, if it means that when other people see you, they don't see Christ, there's a problem with it. If it means that when people see you, they don't see really a difference and a change, there's a problem. He tells them, yes, you are called to serve. Yes, you're called to go out. You shouldn't just run away and hide. But be careful, because there has to be this discernment in life. And again, one of the things we need to understand, we are called to serve others, not our own flesh. This should be our way of life. Jesus said he came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. A ransom for many. Of course, some of you probably heard about it with Bud Light and the campaign that they did, and they try to say, well, we didn't do that campaign, but they're pushing this one transgender individual, this man, Dylan Mulvaney, and everyone's talking about it. They were so angry and mad, so people were throwing out their beers left and right. Boy, they were just, so angry. And I saw some people that, they claim to be Christian, but they said, I ain't drinking Bud Light ever again. Never again. I'm thinking, why are you even drinking it in the first place? So Bud Light lost about $6 billion in their market, shares and things. And so they're trying to cover the tracks and everything else. But I'm thinking to myself, how ridiculous is it that a person thinks they're righteous for standing against that and they go and buy Corona? That to me just boggles the mind. But this is where we are in this country as well. We are called to serve others, not our flesh. And it should be our way of life. The second thing Paul goes on to say, notice, he says in verse 25, whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Now he even tells them, if you go and you go to a place that some in the meat market, that they're offering up the meat for sale, don't ask if it's offered to idols. Just buy it. For conscience sake. He said, because the fact is that once you know that it's offered to idols, and you buy it and someone else that is a weaker brother or sister, they eat and they say, wait a minute, is this food offered to idols? And it begins to hinder them in their walk with the Lord. He said the reality, look, it doesn't matter if it's cheaper. You are wanting to edify people around you. You're wanting to show Christ. You're wanting to do things the right way. It's the same for us. He said, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If any of them that believe not bid you to go to a feast. If they're unbelievers, again, notice Paul didn't say, don't go with them. They don't believe. Don't eat with them. He says, no. And if you're disposed to go, he said, if they don't believe, yet they go, and you want to go, whatever is given to you, whatever's served, he said, don't try to even figure out what it is. With the food, he says, and what he's meaning in this is, again, he's saying, have no question. Don't ask a question about where it's at. Hey, because once you find out, if you find out that meat was offered to idols, then you're in a predicament. Because then you really need to. And he says, if they tell you, hey, this meat is offered to idols, then you can say, I'm sorry. I can't participate. I can't eat it. He said, again, it is discernment. And I think we've lost it for so many. To actually sit there in our lives when we make decisions and say, is this going to uplift the name of Christ? Is this going to edify this person? Is it going to draw that person closer to Christ or away from Christ? We have to do that. The way of life should be that. So Paul says, as we notice in verse 34, if I be by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of? For that which I give thanks. And he says in verse 31, very, very powerful and familiar verse here, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. Do you believe that? Whatever you eat, whatever you drink, whatever you do it for what? Glory of God. Not for your flesh, not for your benefit, not for your financial wealth, not for that, for the glory of God. So one, we live our lives serving others, not our flesh. It should be a way of life. Two, God's glory must be our heart's passion. His glory has to always be the heart's passion in our life. Whatever you do, whether you eat, whether you drink, whatever you do, it should be to the glory of God. I've mentioned this before, but I knew one guy that he ended up getting saved in his life. And later on, he said, well, I believe I may be called to preach. But then he would go and he'd watch some things that were just horrendous and trash. He would listen to some horrible music, and I would ask him about it. And he'd say, well, I'm just feeding my flesh a little. Just a little, this idea. I just need a little taste. Just a little bit of the world. Just a little bit of that. And that's the mentality for some people. You go to church, Sunday, you're there, you sit there, you get filled up, you got holiness. Your holy meter is now here. Now you leave, and now you go Monday, and you drink a little, but the holy meter kind of goes down just a little bit. Here's the warning right here. But, you're still kind of here. Now, I may sound foolish with that, but I believe that that's for a lot of people, their mentality. And then, then comes Tuesday. And boy, you bless somebody out really badly on the road. But, it just goes down a little bit because they deserved it. And then, come Thursday and Friday, Friday, God can't hold you against, you had a tough week, a rough week. You should be able to enjoy yourself, live your life, do what you want to do. And then, if it gets close down to here, you'll just say, well, I'll make up for it on Sunday. Boy, that's the way many people live. What a horrible way to live, by the way. You know why? Because we have no excuse, do we? He never ever will put you in a place where you cannot say no. Or he won't put you in a place where you will be able to overcome and have that victory. The final thing is this. We understand God's glory must be our heart's passion. And finally, the spread of the gospel should be our mind's focus. He says, give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God. Do not try to be a hindrance in the gospel. Now again, he's not saying to tolerate. He's not saying to say, well, you've offended so-and-so. You really hurt their feelings. You need to stop. He's saying here, though, that if you live your life and it hinders somebody from seeing the light of the gospel, you've messed up. He said, even as I please all men in all things, I don't seek mine own profit, but the profit of many. Why? That they may be saved. That they may be saved. That's the bottom line. Our mind always has to be focused. Not our flesh. You seek to serve others. That should be your way of life. The glory of God should be your heart's passion in all that you do. Glorifying God, and ultimately the mind's focus in what you are doing has to be the spread of the gospel. Why? So others can be saved. That has to be it. Well, I deserve this. Well, I do what I want, I've done my time. I'm here now. I've done my time. No, it doesn't end. It doesn't end. Always. That should be the way you live in life. That's what God is calling us to. I end with this. Hudson Taylor, Chinese missionary. He was a missionary to China for 54 years. Began in the 1800s. And there were a lot of missionaries that didn't really like what he did because, what he did? He dressed up like Chinese. He didn't go and actually try to start Americanizing people, or where he was from, at least, and the country that he was from. He didn't just try to do that. He actually integrated into the culture. He didn't live a life of wickedness, but he had a lot of them at that time. They had long robes, and the hair that they had, had a little ponytail thing just all down. So there was some that said, how dare you? But again, he believed he ultimately came to place. He said, I want to be part of them and learn them and teach them Christ in any way that I can. And God used him mightily. And of course, the gospel spread there in China. And over 800 missionaries ended up going through the efforts, through the mission work that he was doing. And the country had 125 schools. They had over 20,000 Christians get saved as a result of all the efforts taking place. There was a lot that took place. And when Hudson Taylor died, a young Chinese evangelist looked on his body. And he said this when he saw Hudson Taylor's lifeless body. He said, dear and venerable pastor, we too are your little children. And you opened for us the road to heaven. We do not want to bring you back, but we will follow you. And again, in his own words, he was simply just saying, you've shown us the light. You've shown us the way. Through the way that you lived, we don't want you to come back, but we want to go with you. And I wonder in our lives as well, are there people like that when they see us? We're going to leave an example behind, and it's going to be good or bad. What kind of influence? What kind of example? Paul said, be ye followers of me, even as I am of Christ. Why could he say that? Because again, he focused to serve others. His focus was the glory of God. His focus was the spread of the gospel. I hope that's the same as well for your life, because others may look back and say, well, don't be like so-and-so. This is what happened. No. God calls us not to express ourselves. He calls us to die to ourselves and to live for Jesus Christ. To allow his life to live through us. But let's pray this morning.